Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt.
And I'm Sebastian.moore.
And today we're thrilled to be joined by lawyer and writer Luke Gittos. Welcome, Luke.
Hello, guys. Nice to be here.
Really pleased you could join us. We heard you speak at a Spike Summit a couple of weeks ago where you were really fantastic. So we were really keen to get you on. So thanks for coming along. Do you want to just start by just saying a bit about what you do? Lawyer and writer covers a lot of things, but I know you've done some fairly important stuff recently. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I'm a criminal lawyer, so I prepare cases for criminal courts in England and Wales. That's basically my day job. But when I was at university, I started reading a magazine called Spiked and very quickly got interested in politics, and particularly the politics of civil liberties, of free speech. I remember at the time I met people from Spike because I was running a campaign on our university campus to repeal the no platform policy against inviting what they called fascist speakers onto campus. And a group of friends and I thought that that was in opposition to free speech. So perhaps provocatively, we started a campaign to have that no platform policy repealed, largely inspired by reading Spiked and their kind of absolutist take on free speech, which I found very, very inspiring and influential. And then I met a lot of people involved in politics. And over the last, I started writing for Spiked about, I must be 12 years ago now at least, on the law. And that really grew until, I was a columnist with them, whilst also being a lawyer. And it's quite unusual to be both a lawyer and engaged openly in politics, because most lawyers don't like saying what they really think. It's sort of a professional no-no for most people. But I think I've survived long enough that now people sort of know what to expect. And that means I can continue to write and continue to speak and say what I think about things. And most recently, thanks to the Free Speech Union, which is, for those who don't know, an organisation run by Toby Young, supported by a network of lawyers, but also activists and thinkers and writers. They do an incredible job of funding people's legal representation in cases involving free speech. And I was very, very lucky, I think 3 or 4 years ago, to be instructed in some of their work. And I've effectively maintained that relationship with them, meaning that I get to act in some really interesting free speech related cases. And in that capacity, we've had some really significant wins, I think. We could talk a bit about people who have been prosecuted for the things that they say on social media, people who have been prosecuted for saying things that probably the majority of people would think is perfectly permissible political speech. I defended also the Telegraph journalist Alison Pearson in a confrontation with Essex Police when she was investigated for her tweets. We were obviously successful in having that investigation stopped. And there's lots of other cases that perhaps make fewer headlines, but which are very important to work on, because without the intervention of the Free Speech Union and the lawyers that work with them, these people would be subject to a very different experience in their criminal trial, and probably most of them would end up pleading guilty. And because it's hard to underestimate the impact that having a lawyer that really cares can have on your ability to fight a case. And so and so now my work basically covers both writing, but legal practice, which is my day-to-day job, and then also trying to explore issues around free speech and the law and the place of the law in wider society.
There was a really sweet moment at the Spiked Summit where Alison Pearson thanked you from the stage, and you could tell from the audience that it wasn't just thanking you for your professional services, but it was the fact that she had somebody in her corner defending her, because I think it can feel quite lonely at a moment like that. I've luckily not been in a situation where the police have turned up and knocked on my door and arrested me. But you can think, even for somebody like her, who's a Telegraph journalist, somebody that writes for a living, you can, I imagine, in that situation suddenly think, oh no, have I done something wrong here? And to perhaps for her to not feel alone in that situation was clearly valuable. I wonder if you could just elaborate on the Jamie Michaels case, because That was one that perhaps people, maybe it flew under the radar. I know politically informed people might know about it, but some of our audience won't.
Yeah, so Jamie Michael was a ex-member of our military who lived down in Merthyr Tydfil or near Merthyr Tydfil in the Welsh Valleys. And in the aftermath of the Southport murders, he'd taken to Facebook and made a video about illegal migration and effectively saying there are lots of unchecked illegal immigrants coming into the country, that we're seeing the fruits of that in Southport. Now, of course, he wasn't right about that, but he's nonetheless right about the overall picture with regards to illegal immigration. He said that he wanted to organise meetings in order to protect local communities from dangerous people. He said he wanted to put pressure on political parties and political individuals in Parliament in order to change the dial. And he used quite strong language, but not language which was offensive or racist, at least in my view. People can actually see the transcript if they go to, if they Google Jamie Michael, you'll find the transcript of the video very quickly. And he was arrested following a complaint that was made by a local Labour councillor in Merthyr Tydfil. So, or not, sorry, not a councillor themselves, but a member of their staff. So a local member of staff for a Labour councillor made a criminal complaint to the police about the video, saying that they believed this was incitement to racial hatred. Two officers reviewed the video and found nothing wrong with it, and then effectively it was elevated and they decided to launch an investigation. That investigation resulted in Jamie being arrested at his place of work, put into custody and held on remand for 17 days. Now, if you think that sounds like a long time, he could have been on remand for a lot longer than that had it not been for a successful bail application that got him out of prison. But I mean, he could have, in theory, been on remand facing until his trial if nothing else had happened. And if you watch the video, if you read the transcript, it looks like a strongly worded speech, which might be made by any one of us who are concerned about the kind of issues that Jamie's talking about. And for me, it was sort of a must-win case because if we'd lost, the precedent that would have been set would have been really terrifying. I mean, you know, Crown Courts don't set legal precedents, but I think they do set the tone for how these cases are dealt with by the police and the prosecution. And what can happen is if the police and prosecution find that they're getting a series of successful convictions by interpreting the evidence in a particular way, then that can influence the decisions that they make around charging people or opening investigations, etc. But thankfully, we worked on the case very, very hard, along with Adam King, a barrister from QEB Hollis Whiteman Chambers, who deserves a shout out for his work on the case as well. But it took the jury 17 minutes to acquit him. So there's quite a nice symmetry between the 17 days he was held on remand and the 17 minutes it took to acquit him. And although it's hard to read juries sometimes, we saw throughout the trial that the jury were having absolutely none of it, really. I mean, they can be quite hard to read, but there was just this sense in the room that the idea that this man would be prosecuted for this was totally ridiculous. And it was one of those moments where you realise how important the jury system is in protecting the integrity of our justice system and pushing back against interpretations of the law that don't fit with public morality. So he was acquitted, but that wasn't the end of the story. He has been involved in a lot of disputes around his ongoing work with children. The investigation obviously took him out of his life for over a year. And in that time, he was facing a possible prison sentence of up to 7 years. So it does, you know, these cases are hugely important. And you know, there have been others like him who have been prosecuted either for being on particular demonstrations and getting caught up in trouble that they weren't actually involved with. We had a case like that that resulted in another acquittal just last month. So someone who attended a demonstration after Southport had gone to a demonstration outside an asylum hotel and had been caught up in the trouble that occurred there, but hadn't committed any violence, hadn't thrown anything, hadn't been involved in any disorder at all, and had actually tried to leave the scene in order to go home, but had been stopped doing so. He was also arrested and charged with violent disorder. And again, we worked very hard to try and get his case thrown out before trial, but that didn't work. But once the case was in front of the jury, he was acquitted very, very quickly. So I think what we see in these cases is juries often pushing back against the harsh application of the law and the harsh interpretation of the law against free speech. And that's why I think these cases are so important.
And there's 2 points there, isn't there? One is that people who think that there isn't an issue often say that, oh yeah, but they were found not guilty. But it just ruins your life, doesn't it? It's not, even if you are tried quite quickly and found not guilty, I just think people around you still always have that kind of doubt in the back of their minds, don't they? And how do you live your life with that hanging over you? It just must pull the rug out from underneath you completely. And the other point was just in terms of the person who complained in that Jamie Michael case, which you said was one of the staffers of one of the council employees. It does feel we've got this layer of people who I actually think they're doing the right thing. They think they're fighting fascism, who are creating all these problems. And I just wonder how we have that discussion with those kind of people. I mean, does that bring you to your council meeting today? Does that tie into that?
Yeah, definitely. And but perhaps just beforehand, can I just ask about the pleading guilty or not guilty? Because people might be aware of the Lucy Connolly case where she pled guilty, didn't she? What is the reason? What are the sort of incentives for one in that situation that is probably not so aware of the law and the legal implications? What was the reason that Jamie Michael pleaded not guilty?
Well, the reason Jamie Michael pleaded not guilty is Jamie Michael. He's a fighter, and he made the decision, the extremely brave decision, at a time when he didn't know he had legal support, to fight his case. I mean, and that for me is extraordinarily brave. And I can't imagine what it takes to say that, yes, I'm going to be willing to suspend my life for a period of 18 months to see if I will or will not face a very substantial prison sentence. I mean, that is such a huge decision. And it can be so easy to say, look, I want some certainty here. I accept I did something wrong, even though I don't accept I broke the law. I can accept I shouldn't have made the video or something along those lines. And you might think, well, the jury are going to hate me because they'll think I'm a racist and they'll think I'm being offensive. And so let's just get this out the way and done. And the incentive is that you receive a very substantial discount on your sentence if you plead guilty early. And I think in Lucy Connolly's case, her appeal actually focused on the process through which she came to plead guilty. And Adam King, the barrister I mentioned earlier, was also the barrister in Lucy Connolly's appeal. And it's worth reading the Court of Appeal judgment in Lucy Connolly's case to see, if you're interested in the question of why people plead guilty, that judgment of the Court of Appeal examined in greater detail than usual how Lucy Connolly came to enter that plea and why she did, and whether she was properly informed and advised when she did so. My impression is that Lucy thought that she would be going home a lot quicker if she pled guilty as soon as possible, and that she wouldn't receive the kind of sentence that she eventually did receive. And there was a significant dispute around whether Lucy Connolly had pleaded on the correct factual basis. But she's also someone who I think, had she gone to trial, she would have stood a really good chance, because her tweet, which has been widely quoted, included quite a heavy caveat, which said, as far as I'm concerned, they can burn all the asylum hotels down. Now, what she said wasn't attractive at all. It was not the right, an appalling thing to say. But that, as far as I'm concerned, they can, may have given her a window through which to fight the case. And it's because people aren't even, if a lawyer goes into a meeting with a client in that kind of circumstance, when they're facing quite a serious charge where the evidence looks quite cut and dry, the lawyer might think, well, this case is never going to win at trial. What's the point in challenging it? Let's just get this resolved as quickly as we can. And if the lawyer goes into that conference or meeting with that in their mind, then it's very easy for them to phrase the advice to plead guilty is the right thing to do. And it sounds as though that's what, I mean, I wasn't there, but it sounds as though that's something like what happened in Lucy's case. But we weren't there with Jamie Michael, you know, we weren't in the room with him. He had to take that decision for himself. He had to turn around and say, no, not this guy. I'm going to fight it. And to me, that's extraordinarily brave.
Mm. Sorry, I battered away your nice little segue there to Manchester City Council meeting, which, interestingly, the council's in purdah currently because there is the mayoral election in, I think, 30th of July, so a couple of weeks' time. So there was a lot of drama today because they're not showing it on the live stream as they normally will, and they're delaying it until after the election for mayor takes place. So this is kind of like exclusives that I'm sharing. There was a lot of problem, which I found interesting, with which councillors could say what, because two of the councillors present are candidates for that mayoral election. So Richard Kilpatrick of the Lib Dems and Sean Astley of Reform. Bev Craig, who's the Labour leader of Manchester City Council, was not present at the meeting, so she chose not to be there. And there was an attempt to stop people from speaking because they said they were using it as a political platform. And when it was pointed out that the event wasn't live streamed, they said, well, what about the public gallery? I'm sat in the public gallery with 6 other people, and I thought, don't worry, guys, we're not going to swing the election. But the reason I bring it up is that there was this motion it was a motion against far-right rhetoric, and it was proposed by a councillor of the Green Party. And it was there was an amendment made by somebody of the Labour Party, which the Green Party had agreed to. So there was cross-party support for this, and Reform were the only ones to speak up against it. And I will try and steelman the position because obviously I'll give my opinion as we talk about this. But I'm very much against the motion. But the idea with it was that we're seeing much more far-right violence on our streets. We're seeing protests outside asylum hotels. They quoted the asylum hotel, which we talked about in the podcast 2 weeks ago, which is just up the road from me in South Manchester. And they said that these people are coming from outside of the town, and they're coming to intimidate vulnerable people that are asylum seekers that are inside these hotels. They said we have to condemn it and we have to push back, and we cannot allow parties like Reform to use this for their political advantage, to whip up rhetoric that has nothing to do with legitimate political opinions about immigration. And that is the motion. So what do we think about that?
Well, I think legitimate opinions about immigration, well, all opinions are legitimate, aren't they? Why would you argue that some opinions aren't legitimate?
What you're saying is who gets to decide what is legitimate and what is not. You know, that's what the political process is for, to decide whether these opinions are valid and to hear from the people so that you can represent them. And it seems like the concern that I would have, and maybe you would share, is that it's quite anti-democratic, and it's crossing over the line from genuine concern for political violence and actually trying to stop people from expressing and having the right to express their political views.
Yeah. And this motion was about any kind of public expression of views. It wasn't about the expression of those views within the council. So
it's a really, really long motion.
Right.
And it had loads of different things about what they're going to do. A lot of it was fluff, as you might imagine. The Reform spokesperson, a chap called Dylan Evans, Councillor Dylan Evans from Charlestown, he spoke up and explained that whilst they're trying to condemn far-right rhetoric and saying this isn't about legitimate political opinion, at the same time they're attacking Reform, a legitimate political party that is represented in the Council of Manchester. And he said that those two things don't go hand in hand. So a lot of this was focusing on things like the Equality Act and the Human Rights Acts, and saying we have to make sure that we don't allow a future government to repeal these things, and we reassure the citizens of Manchester that their human rights won't be affected.
It doesn't sound like a sensible way for a council to be spending its time. Did anybody mention the potholes at this stage?
No, and I spoke to the few other people in the public gallery, and I said, the entertainment that this is giving us is probably in equal measure to the detriment of the council, because they should be speaking about boring things like potholes and bins, but instead they're speaking about national political issues. But it fitted so well with the discussion that we were going to have. And they obviously brought up the tragic case of Anne Widdecombe being murdered, and that political violence does seem to be on the rise. And what I found interesting is something we talk about, is the breakdown of the political. And they were, I think, unaware of the fact that, or perhaps even maybe sneering of the populace, thinking that the populace are going to be in favour of political violence. So they're trying to prevent the electorate from having their will heard. And I would say, as a Democrat and somebody that believes in democracy, fundamentally, that I trust the British public, and I trust that the political violence is being perpetrated by a very, very small minority of the electorate. And actually, we have to re-engage the public and allow them to have their voices heard. And often, and I think this came up at the Spiked Summit, Luke, often those that are perhaps less a bit more colourful with their language are ones that aren't super engaged in politics. And as we try and demonise them for that, it's just going to put people off, expressing their opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot to come up there. I mean, I think I'll start by saying that words aren't violence. And I think we over the last sort of 15 or 20 years, maybe longer, we've elided those two things quite significantly in how we talk. So the idea that an argument can do someone harm is quite common. And I remember being at university and people saying that some of the ideas we were debating at our debating society threatened people's physical safety. And this idea, I think, had a lot of strength on university campuses. So a lot of campuses started to adopt restrictive practices on freedom of speech because they took certain arguments to actually be dangerous for students and to threaten their safety. And I think we've allowed that argument to, the people that were students when I was at university are now in significant areas of public policy. Wes Streeting was head of the NUS when I was at Sussex. He used to come speak at our campus occasionally. So this is not to be underestimated, the influence of campus culture in the, early 2010s or just before 2010 and now, because you're now seeing the people who came of age in that period where speech was thought to be physically harmful are now making policy and perhaps even sitting in councils. On Anne Widdecombe, I think the police are in a really tricky position sometimes, because one thing that's been very interesting in the aftermath of this appalling killing is they were criticised after Southport for not being able to say anything and keeping silence for quite a long time, and then coming out with some facts. And on this occasion, they came out very quickly, but told us something that's completely wrong. And so I do get that the police are in a double bind. If they say something that they think too early, they'll be criticised, and if they don't say anything, they're criticised for holding back. But I think the police just need to hold the investigative line and understand their job properly. So what that means is prioritise the investigation and don't worry about anything else. Because what is in the back of their minds is they think it's their job to control the public and to make sure that the public don't protest and come out on the street. And the moment that there is disorder, or the moment that a killing is used for some kind of political purpose, the police seem to think that that's part of their responsibility to prevent. You saw this in the aftermath of Southport, where you see it also in the aftermath of the Henry Novak killing, where effectively the police were criticised again for not properly controlling the narrative, and this leading to violent protests in the name of Henry Novak. So the police sort of now, I think, it's just clear that they see as part of their role the control of information and therefore the management of the public. And so that's what's given them this double bind, because they won't ever win that. They won't ever get that right. What they can get right is just sticking to, well, we need to find out what happened. We need to find out what happened accurately, as fast as possible. And we can't jeopardize that by telling the public anything too soon or too late. And I think if they just refocused on their investigative purpose and their job, then they'd be able to make that balance work a lot better than they currently are. On the Human Rights Act and the Equalities Act, just briefly, if I can, it is extraordinary to me that the position that these particular pieces of legislation have taken in the public imagination. So it's almost seen like if we repeal the Human Rights Act, we will return, and this is said all the time, we will return to Berlin in the 1930s. That's said fairly often about the possible impact of repealing the Human Rights Act. Similarly, with the Equalities Act, they say, people say, well, if we repeal the Equalities Act, men and women will immediately be unequal in the workplace again. And there'll be no protections for people being paid differently or suffering racial discrimination. It's just nonsense. It is complete and utter nonsense because, firstly, the Human Rights Act incorporates a piece of law from Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights. And the European Convention on Human Rights was based on the common law rights that were drawn from English common law. So common law is the law made by our domestic courts, by judges. And so, for example, the right to trial by jury is a common law right. It's something that's emerged in the law courts as a result of senior judicial figures, as a result of developments in the trial process. It's not something that was created by the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's not something that will go away because we repeal the Human Rights Act. In fact, as you've seen, the right to jury trial is being diluted thanks to David Lammy and his proposals to limit jury trials domestically. So the Human Rights Act largely draws on our own history of common law freedom. And if we got rid of it, firstly, we could immediately pass legislation that protected the freedoms that we really wanted to protect, if we wanted to do that. But we could also repeal some of the statute, so some of the legislation that actually limits our freedom in this country. So we could roll back on some of the pieces of anti-free speech law that we see being used to prosecute people all the time. So getting rid of the Human Rights Act wouldn't mean a return to the 1930s. In fact, I think it would mean us looking again at some of where these freedoms are in our national conversation and thinking about how we can really robustly protect civil liberties rather than relying on the European Court of Human Rights to do it for us. So that's it. Just on that, it's interesting that those two pieces of legislation come up at a local council meeting and are discussed in such vehement terms. I thought that was worth noting.
The really interesting aspect of this for me is that as Democrats and as people that believe in the sovereignty of Parliament, we think that a future generation should be able to build the political will to do something and to change the laws that we are implementing, or we in an SDP government might implement. That was made by the Reform Councillor, and somebody in the public gallery said to me, "Yeah, but what if the future public vote for slavery? Would we allow that to happen?" And I think that part of the breakdown of the political, and this is something we talk about all the time, is that we've lost a sense of how you enact change and how you build a political consensus for something. I think the concerns from the other side, and I'm really trying to get into the head, which might be a dangerous practice, perhaps I shouldn't be doing it, but I think the concerns are they think that there is certain legislation that has been passed in previous decades, let's say, that enables us to have more equality, to treat each other fairly, and they think that their political enemies are, I would say, exploiting certain sentiments in the British public in order to put forward a malevolent agenda, which would include repealing certain legislation. So when you say we could repeal the Human Rights Act and then immediately pass legislation in order to protect certain rights, the argument would be, but they're not going to do that. They're trying to take away our rights. This is a question for both of you, is there any merit to that concern that that's what the political right is trying to do?
I mean, I think one of this a lot of this stems from the EU, and I know I'm always blaming the EU for everything, but I do think that, I mean, certainly if you play that argument in a kind of trade union framework, so trade unions would defend to the death the Equality Act and all the things that flow from it, and in fact, that the current government is actually trying to strengthen the Equality Act in some ways in terms of how you define work of equal value. And they would think, they've been given the impression that all of those rights are things that we inherited from Europe. They don't think that those things were fought for and won by workers in the UK, which they were, so things like an Equal Pay Act we had before we had, EU requirements. But they've kind of got this kind of good and evil schema in their head that says these things on the good side, these things on the bad side. Now, the good side are the EU, the Equality Act, all those kind of things that are kind of code-based way of running your life. And they've absolutely absorbed that idea that you can't just have informal relations and ways of working, and you can't have a law that just says everything's legal unless we've said it's illegal. They've adopted this, I would say it's a very European stance of saying that the law has to codify and write down everything that we can and can't do. And so if you living within that world where the law has to do all those things, if you're going to take that law away to them, I think that does mean you then leave them in limbo where anything could happen. And I think because they do see things like change as a bad thing, they don't think change is a good thing, change is generally a bad thing. I think they do automatically think that would make the world worse. And I do think that, and you say you're trying to get inside their heads, and I do think it's important to try and understand where people are coming from politically, because I think there's just a danger at the moment in popular discourse of people just, divided into tribes and almost willfully not understanding each other. And I don't think that's helpful. I think we've got to try and understand where people are coming from. And that's why I say, when the people who complained about Jamie Michael, I think probably did think that they were doing the right thing. And they feel that, you always have to look to the law, the state, to intervene in those human relationships and make them functional. So I kind of think the only way to build a belief in our ability to get along as people and to have agency and to change the world for good is to do that at a kind of really basic human level. I'm back to mending my park benches again, really. That I think you've got to go out and do those kind of things and show people that you can make a difference and you can, working together without the state intervening, you can make those kind of differences.
Just on your point about could a democracy pass an act supporting slavery? I mean, if we're in a society that in theory supports slavery, the law's not going to help, because you're in a very turbulent, violent society in that circumstance. And you saw this you actually did see this in Berlin in the 1930s, where a society, a populace, turned against a minority very violently. They could have had a Human Rights Act in 1930s Germany. It wouldn't have prevented anything. In fact, what people really need to recognise is how weak those protections can be when it really matters. The reason they make those arguments is they get the relationship between social morality and the law largely the wrong way round. Almost always throughout history, the greatest gains in the law have come around as a result of a change in social attitudes, a mass change in social attitudes. You saw this most prominently in the American civil rights movement, where, for example, the decision in Brown and Board of Education that prevented segregation in schools. I mean, firstly, that came at the end of a very sustained period of national protestation and a national movement. But also, it did not change minds in the way that wider society is capable of changing minds. What I mean by that is the fact that the Supreme Court had made this decision in Brown and Board of Education did not stop the problems in young black children going to mixed schools. In fact, it did the opposite. It kind of forced the issue on societies and sections of the society that weren't quite ready for it, and it created real tension. And there's a fantastic essay by Hannah Arendt on this issue called Reflections on Little Rock, which I always go back to when I'm thinking about the relationship between the law and social attitudes. And in this country as well, you see all the big changes that we like to talk about when we come to the law being more progressive. For example, the freeing up of sexual relationships, the decriminalisation of homosexuality, for example. Those weren't examples where we passed a new law to protect homosexuals. Those are examples where we repealed laws that were criminalising homosexuals. And the difference is huge and really significant. Because in one circumstance, you remove the power of the state to impact on people's lives for doing things that you want to protect them doing, i.e. being with who they want to be, etc. But when you pass a law to try and enforce a progressive value, you pass control for that over to a judge, and you allow the judge and the state to basically mediate the parameters of those freedoms. And that's what I think we've seen when it comes to freedom of speech, when it comes to freedom of protest, when it comes to who we do and do not have in the country as asylum seekers. All of these really, really important questions have basically been passed over to judges to decide. And that really takes the power out of our hands. I mean, if you look at some of these, if you look at, say, a judgment on what is or is not acceptable speech, let's say, that's been taken by either a court in this country or the European Convention on Human Rights, they often run to over like 115 pages because they're so complicated. No one is going to read them apart from people like me or people as sad as I am. And it's just for me, I always talk about the length of these judgments because it illustrates so perfectly how the regulation of these freedoms is so arcane to most people. Like, most people couldn't say what the law says freedom of speech is. Most people are no longer qualified to say what the law says freedom of speech is. But we know it. We know the freedom. We know what freedom of speech means. We know inherently when we don't like someone being criminalised for what they say. And the majority of the British people have this sort of innate sense of freedom of speech, I think. The really worrying thing about the evolution of human rights, and I think why we need to kind of fight over the, I totally agree with you, Hilary, about this good-bad dichotomy. And I think the really important reason we need to push that down is because we've sort of become totally uncritical about how these laws work and what they actually do to our political culture. And that's when we really start switching off about the enforcement of our freedoms and the protection of our freedoms. People are, as I've spoken about, being prosecuted en masse for what they say and what they think and what they express and how they demonstrate and what they look at online and how they express their anti-religious sentiment, for example. These are really important political questions that we can't afford to pass over to the law to regulate. They have to be things that are subject to political contestation. We have to be arguing about what these freedoms mean, how far they extend, and we don't need a 115-page judgment of a high court to instruct us on that. And I really think taking these freedoms back from the jurisdiction of the court and placing them back in the realm of political contestation is probably the big challenge of our times.
Mm.
I think that's right. And I think in some ways it actually goes even further than you suggest, because I do think those cases like the Next case and the Birmingham bin cases effectively put the ability to decide the rate of pay of people into the hands of the state and judges. And, that's interference in kind of the market and the economy. And I'm not saying you should never interfere in the market and the economy, but that feels like a completely arbitrary way to do it.
Mm. And
if I can just very quickly make a point about repeal, because I think sometimes on the right of politics there is this fetishization around repealing the Human Rights Act, and Seb, you mentioned it. It's like, well, all we need to do is repeal the Human Rights Act and everything will be better. All our problems will be solved. We'll have a strong border. We'll have strong protections for our freedoms. We'll be able to, live in our free society once again. And I think that's the danger that reform are in at the moment. that basically they end up saying, well, we're going to repeal the Human Rights Act. Well, we're going to deport X number of people a year. Well, we're going to do that. And I think there's a real danger that we lose sight of, firstly, our humanity when it comes to our discussion around immigration and asylum. I think reform needs an asylum policy. I think any mainstream party needs an asylum policy, unless you simply want to close the border completely, which I don't think the British public want to do, by the way. But you also need a really clear framework for how you protect or enshrine freedom after the Human Rights Act goes. It's not enough simply to say, well, that act has gone, job done. We still live in a society where civil liberties are undermined and challenged every day. So pushing back against that is a live political problem, and sometimes those in the Tory party and those and in Reform now are in the danger of merely arguing to repeal the Human Rights Act with nothing to follow it up.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, if you wanted to put that in a workplace scenario, I think I'm very much of the opinion that we do need a Great Repeal Act to get rid of a lot of the EU code-based legislation. But it's not just doing that, because I think what you would also want to do is to get rid of some of the anti-trade union legislation so that trade unions are freed up to actually defend people in the workplace and to fight for working terms and conditions and pay in a way that they can't do now. Because at the moment, the way they do all those things is through this handed down EU legislation. And they've got to start being trade unions who fight on an industrial basis again, which they're prevented from doing by the anti-trade union laws. So it's a massive bonfire of the legislation I think we need.
I was thinking this conversation is incredibly wide-ranging. And then it occurred to me that all of the things we're discussing came up during that one motion in the council meeting this morning. Far-right rhetoric, asylum hotel protests, the Equality Act, Anne Widdecombe and Henry Novak were all mentioned. And I wondered if we can get on to Henry Novak. So the Reform councillor made the point that his last words, we think, were, "I'm not racist." And for anybody that doesn't know, Henry Novak was murdered by Vikram Digwa, and the police at the time didn't realise that he'd been stabbed. It's a horrible, horrible event. I have watched the video. I don't think you have.
No, I haven't.
I didn't have the stomach for it. But we've been talking about the response to this, because it's easy, I suppose, for anybody when they're involved in politics, and of course we're involved in politics as members of the SDP, it's easy to choose which things you speak about in order to somewhat profit off them. And it's always a thing that you have to ask yourself. And I know we've been in this situation on debate stages and at hustings where you say, okay, am I using this just to profit off it politically? And I wonder how we find that line, because we noticed that a lot of the Henry Novak stuff, we need to have a conversation about this, definitely. But a lot of it is sounding very similar to that of the George Floyd incident in 2020. And I suppose it's easy for these things to become, we'd say become politicized, right? But for at least for them to be blown out of proportion. So some of the factors might be exaggerated in order to pursue a particular political agenda. Is that something you're concerned with, Luke?
I think the Henry Novak case is incredibly difficult to pick apart, because I think there's so much of it which demands our attention, and which demands, I think it's a case that should be treated as a moment of institutional crisis. There's no doubt about that in my mind. It is extraordinary, in my view, that the officers behaved in the way that they did. Extraordinary for so many different reasons. It seemed to me like a complete suspension of their duty. It seemed as though the policing that they were doing, there was no attempt to establish the real facts, and they did not respond to the information that was given to them. So they were told 9 times by Henry that he'd been stabbed, and that just wasn't acted on. And then they took the words of the victim, of the attackers, as read. So they said, and the attacker's family as read, saying, there was a moment when the attacker's family said he hasn't been stabbed, and the officer said, well, I know, but we have to check, don't we? And those sorts of things, you know, and they put handcuffs on Henry as he died. There was absolutely no basis for them to do that. There was nothing for him to be arrested for. That's what quite often it's not spoken about, is that there was absolutely zero reason to arrest him. In order to arrest someone, it has to be necessary. It has to be necessary to investigate a crime that is suspected to have taken place. And handcuffs need to be necessary. And Henry Novak was lying on the floor dying, and they put handcuffs on him. And so there's so many elements to this which signified complete institutional failure. And to me, we can't gloss over that. We can't pretend this didn't happen. We can't pretend that because of the nature of some of our political discourse that this has been blown out of proportion. I think it's about right in terms of the proportion that we're affording it. And I do hope there is an institutional attention on the case that lasts, because for me, it has a lot of parallels with the Stephen Lawrence case in some respects, because the Macpherson inquiry looked into the circumstances around the investigation into Stephen Lawrence and found that, you know, the police had made a number of assumptions about what had happened based on the colours Dwayne Brooks, the lead witness's skin. And in this case, I mean, basically the same thing happened, that they made an assumption about Henry Novak and about Vikram Digwal based on the respective colours of their skin. Those two things are depressingly similar between these two cases. And so it does really demand institutional reflection. I think if you go back and look at how this situation arose, there's no doubt that from about the late 1970s to the present day, there has been a significant focus within the police on their relationship with particular communities. So the police tend to view societies broken up into small communities based on, you know, Black Caribbean over there, Black African over there, Indian over here, etc., etc. And they think we need to make sure we're managing relationships between the police and each one of these little communities very, very well. You saw this in how they, in the early 80s, there was a big drive to recruit more ethnic minority police officers, drawing from as many different communities as they possibly could. You see that more explicitly when you have very specific guidance setting out how the police should interact with particular communities based on what they perceive to be community traits and so on. And this becomes an increasing concern, and increasingly they are attempting to atone for the perception of the police that existed in the 70s and 80s, which was largely that it was a racist organisation behaving discriminately and enforcing the law unequally, which was, you know, the police obviously had huge problems with racism for large parts of the 20th century. And so it wasn't entirely unwarranted to give that significant attention. But then, I mean, I'm attempting to deal with a lot of history in quite a short space of time, but it's just undoubtable now that the police see the management of their relationship with communities as a key priority. And that's what leads into the anti-racism guidance that's issued by the National College of Policing. It's what influences the day-to-day guidance that young police officers get given when they're doing their job. You know, they get told how to manage particular individuals from particular backgrounds, what assumptions to apply, what assumptions not to apply. And I think to some extent what we see in the Henry Novak footage is a young white working class man being at the bottom of the potential list of victims. So his concerns were treated last in a situation where tragically they were, you know, the only ones that should have mattered. So what's the I mean, is it the case that some on the right have sought to take advantage of this case in order to score political points? Maybe, but that's probably not the discussion I would focus on. I do think there is something serious to be talked about and something serious that needs interrogating. And I think a big part of it is what I spoke about earlier, which is getting the police back to policing. Mm. If you speak to a lot of police officers today, there is this sense that the forces across the country are totally adrift, unsure of what they're supposed to be prioritising, unsure of what they're supposed to be presenting as their priorities to the public. treated with disdain by the public and the government and members of the political establishment and the journalistic establishment. They're unsure why they're doing the job, a lot of them. And so that is perhaps the deeper problem that we need to talk about, is what we want the police to do and how we give them the tools to do it.
Yeah, you said something at the Spike Summit, which I thought was probably the best reading of the situation that I'd heard, which was that there was a certain level of performativeness amongst the police officers present. And I thought that resonated with me, because I could imagine that in that situation, particularly when you've had years of training and all of the public outrages against police for racism, that they're in that situation wanting to show as much as they can that they're not being racist. And something they said is, when the family said that he hadn't been stabbed, they say, yeah, I know, but we've still got to check him. Right? As if their major concern in that situation was to assuage the concerns of the family, rather than thinking, okay, maybe he has been stabbed and that might be our priority. I guess the question within the Henry Novak case is, how much do we think that the anti-racism measures and some of the guidance that you were talking about impacted the actions of the police officers that day?
That's a really complicated question, but I think it's undoubtable that it did. Because, as you say, why did they feel the need to go through that performance? What were they more worried about? Were they more worried about the possibility, albeit remote, I can sympathise with the officers to this extent, which is, you arrive on a scene, you're not sure quite what's happened. There is a young man who has not got an obvious wound. Okay, so it's not like he was surrounded he wasn't in a pool of blood. And it's dark, and it's late at night, etc. The judge in sentencing the case said that it was a complicated crime scene. But I think if their priority in arriving at that scene had been establishing what had actually happened, they received a lot of really clear information about what had gone on, but they applied assumptions rather than reading that information. So, as I said, Henry Novak saying 9 times that he's been stabbed, seeing that he is lying prone, struggling to breathe, seeing that he's not being responsive, seeing that his eyes are glazing over, seeing that he can't really move. This is all information that should have been very, very urgent to them. But instead, they applied assumptions that one side, the killer's family, were telling the truth, and the lone boy was not telling the truth. And I don't think you can blame you can't blame one line of guidance, because that's what Keir Starmer wanted to do, and what a lot on the centre, right and left wanted to do. They wanted to say, well, yes, there is a real problem with a particular police of the race relations guidance within the police. If we change that, then this problem will be sorted. Of course, that's rubbish, because this is about a cultural problem within the police. It's about how the police are trained to do their job, but then also the way that these assumptions about people and the assumptions about the way the world is just germinate amongst young police officers. I mean, these are young people at the end of the day. They are the products of the society that they live in. And to that extent, they are very, very concerned about being seen to be racist or being seen to be prejudiced. And that, I mean, it's very common for young people to be very worried about being seen to be racist. And it's a perfectly reasonable concern, unless you are in the very specific circumstance of arriving at the scene of a murder, in which case you probably need to suspend that concern and focus on doing the best possible policing job that you can.
It does make me wonder whether body cams are definitely a good thing, in terms of this performative nature of what people are doing. Would they be better without them?
Well, I'd say at least we have the footage and we could see what happened.
Yeah,
in this situation. Otherwise, it might go unnoticed. I mean, Alison Pearson called the police a cult.
She did.
Is that quite stark language, particularly from the right? And someone like Alison Pearson, who I presume sort of identifies as centre-right Telegraph journalist. This is unusual. I mean, we covered the Chris Cabba incident on the podcast, probably coming up for 2 years now ago. And the traditional, certainly in my lifetime, understanding was that the left were kind of sceptical of the police, believed that they were racist, and the right would always back the boys in blue. Is that something that's changing?
Well, I think Alison used that kind of language because she was the victim of quite a cult-like process. I mean, she was targeted for reasons that are extraordinary and totally weird. And she's right in the sense that I think some senior police officers think it's their job to control the thoughts and feelings of the officers beneath them and control the way that those officers think and believe things about the wider world. I think that's all true. I think it's right to mention the Chris Cabba shooting and the targeting of Martin Blake, because we had in this country the first prosecution of a firearms officer in many decades, in circumstances that perhaps most people in the public would think are quite unusual. In that, Chris Cabba did appear to drive his car at police officers. Martin Blake then fired. The jury again acquitted him quite quickly, but he's still facing professional misconduct proceedings. And of course, there was the moment that most people probably ignored at the time, but I thought was extraordinary. I had a friend who, at the time, worked in armed policing, and he said that for at least 48 hours, we had no functioning firearms officers in London because they protested by handing their weapons back and saying, we're not doing this. And the way he phrased it to me is, well, you train for years and years and years in case you might have to use a gun. And then the moment you use your gun, you're on leave until you're formally investigated. It's not really a job worth doing. And so on the left, I think some of the old arguments around the police being discriminatory and overusing stop and search and things still circulate. But on the right, I think there is this emerging sense that the police have lost their authority and therefore do increasingly ridiculous things and aren't institutionally supported in the way that they might once have been, which leaves the people like Martin Blake, the officer that killed Chris Cabba, open to prosecution and to perhaps the kind of thing that wouldn't be imagined 20 or 30 years ago.
Mm. Well, I'm conscious of time.
You're thinking Culture Club.
Yeah. Luke's time as well. He's been very generous with his time so far, but I know he has a day job to do. Yes, we've talked a lot about fighting fascism, so I did think it would be good to bring fighting fascism to Culture Club.
Are you aware of our Culture Club segment, Luke?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about The Sound of Music.
Okay. This is a real tone change, by the way, from talking about police incidents to...
Yeah, but I think you'll find we're still fighting fascism.
Okay.
So I went to see Sound of Music on Saturday in the matinee it's a production by Northern Opera at the Leeds Grand Theatre, which is one of those fantastic, Victorian kind of theatres. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. Great production. The kids were superb. All the kids were superb.
What's The Sound of Music about for anybody that doesn't know?
So it's about the family Von Trapp, who are... the captain has 7 children. His wife has passed away, and they get a new governess in the form of a nun from a local convent. And lots of funny things.
In Austria?
We're in Austria, yes, yeah. Lots of funny things happen. Obviously, what happens is the nun and the captain fall in love. She's not a nun. She's trained to be a nun. They fall in love. So nice. It's a love story at heart, but it's set against the background of the coming annexation of Austria by Germany. So it's a serious story where, because Captain Von Trapp is not willing to join the Nazi navy, I think, actually. They have to escape, and they escape over the mountains. And obviously it's a musical, so there's loads of music, and it's just absolutely fabulous. So Katie Bird played the lead, played Maria, the the governess who goes on to marry the captain. And it was just stunningly brilliant. And Luke, you're going to be the audience here, because me and Sebastian are just going to do you like 4 lines from The Sound of Music. Don't
You're
turn
gonna
off,
sing?
but it's only 4 lines.
You're going to sing. You're going to sing now.
We're not going to sing now.
Okay.
We're going to say some
I
words.
would not agree to it if it was singing.
So Sebastian drew the short straw, and he's the Nazi. So he is Herr Zeller.
Oh no, because now everybody's going to think I'm a Nazi. It just contributes to this level of political dialogue we're at the moment.
It does.
Okay, I'm Herr Zeller.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, here goes a German accent then. Perhaps those who would warn you that the Anschluss is coming, and it is coming, Captain. Perhaps they would get further with you by setting their words to music.
If the Nazis take over Austria, I have no doubt, Herr Zeller, that you will be the entire trumpet section.
You flatter me, Captain.
Oh, how clumsy of me. I meant to accuse you. Come on. How good is that?
That's the first time I've ever been in The Sound of Music.
I have to go and watch the film. I haven't seen it before. It's on the list. But now hearing lines like "you must be the whole trumpet section" has elevated it in my priority list now.
Superb. Yeah.
My mum used to make us watch it, I think, every year. It's my mum's favourite film.
I mean, if you can do a trip to Leeds, Luke, I would go and see it in person. It's absolutely fabulous. And weirdly, I then went, it's again a bit of a cultural, very big jump. I went straight from there to the Peace Hall in Halifax to see the Sex Pistols. And there was a guy standing right in front of me who had one of those, progressive T-shirts on that said on the back of it, fighting fascism since 1977. And I kind of thought, do you know what, mate? I've just been properly fighting fascism. So anyway, the Sex Pistols really good as well. So that's probably another recommendation if people have them come into their local town.
Very good. Have you done anything cultural recently, Luke, that you want to share with us?
I was going to recommend the new film with Jonah Hill, Edward Norton, and I've forgotten how male of me. I've remembered the male actors and forgotten the women, and a woman made it, which is doubly bad. But The Invite, which is a new film about a struggling couple and their interactions with a couple who live upstairs. And I won't say more than that about it, because I think the less you know about it, the better. But it's one of those films that made me laugh out loud. It's a fantastic satire of kind of bourgeois sexual morality, and the acting is brilliant. It's laugh out loud funny and very, very moving. And I just think it captures something about the modern moment, the modern malaise for couples in struggling in intimate relationships really, really well. So yeah, go and see The Invite. It's fantastic.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I've seen adverts for that. That does entice me. I do want to see that.
Great.
And of course, The Odyssey is coming out, and I obviously this has been caught up in the political world because people are concerned that they are casting in a way that is just there to appease the progressives and the progressive film industry. Helen of Troy is played by Lupita Nyong'o, for example. And I've just read a little review on it that's kind of made me want to go and see it, because it said don't look past the sort of the progressive casting, because there's a real brilliant story that is being told which appreciates the values that come from the original story. And the reviewer likened it to a Trojan horse, which I thought was really interesting. So I'm quite excited for The Odyssey as well.
Anything else you're excited for, Sebastian?
I'm very, very excited for the World Cup semi-final this evening. I've got my St George's Cross flags ready to go. Got my England shirt ready to go. I'm going to be going to the local pub and cheering on the boys.
Me too. Yeah, I had to get my shirt washed from Saturday to now. Yes, you'll be watching, Luke.
I will be watching with some friends nearby in a local pub. I'll admit I've struggled to get into the World Cup this year because of the late start times. I've got 2 young kids, so it's quite demanding to stay up until gone 12 in order to watch a football match. I'm not a huge football fan, but it's inevitable when it gets to this stage that you're going to be swept up in it, and so I'll leave in a couple of hours to get down and get a good space for it. And the pubs around where I live, we should be a good laugh.
So I suppose I'm the opposite of you because I've been struggling to do anything productive for the last month because of the late start times. So there we go.
Anyway, well, it's coming home.
It's coming home. Although this will go out after the match. So perhaps we'll look a bit silly, but yeah, there we go.
I think you've got to still believe, haven't you? You've got to believe. Good. Anyway, thanks, Luke, very much for your time. You've been very generous and really fantastic discussion. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and we will see you again soon.
Thanks for listening.